Welcome back. So in the last half of the IRB application, what we're going to do is look at privacy procedures, consent forms, and compensation. In part 4 of the application, we saw where the investigators described their study, talked about how they were going to recruit participants and the procedures those participants were going to follow. Part 5 deals with privacy procedures. Now there's some important terminology that we'll mention here that sometimes we have to correct researchers, and that's the difference between confidential study and an anonymous study. A confidential study means that the researcher knows who participated in the research. An anonymous study means that the researcher does not know who participated in the research. An example of something that might be anonymous would be if the researcher sent out a survey and just collected responses and did not have a way to identify an email address where the response came from, or did not ask for any identifying information. That's an anonymous survey. Privacy procedures really come into play when we're looking at confidential studies. And this is where the researcher knows who participated in the study. So these questions are basically going to be answered yes and no. And if they're a yes, we want a description of what the researcher is going to do. So question 1, will you record any direct identifier, names, social security numbers, addresses, telephone numbers, etc.? And as I tell people, it doesn't matter if you are. There's nothing wrong with doing that. The purpose of the IRB, in part, is to protect the researchers and or the participants. And so what we want to do is, if you're going to collect this information as a researcher, then the board wants to know how you're going to deal with these identifiers. So, for example, if you are collecting a survey and you ask for an email address, then that identifies who participated in the survey and it's confidential. So what are you going to do with that information? Question 2 comes into play. Will you retain a link between the study code numbers and direct identifiers after the data collection is complete? What quite often happens is the researchers will say that it's a confidential study, they know who's going to participate. This is especially true in qualitative studies where there are structured interviews or semi-structured interviews, and they use pseudonyms. So obviously they know who participated in the interviews. And so what question 2 is asking is, if you're going to use a pseudonym for somebody or a code number, will you have a link between identifying what that code number and pseudonym, who the real person is? And again, it's not a problem if you do. The question is, if yes, explain why it's necessary and state how long you will keep this link. A prime example of this is in pre-post studies, where as a quantitative study you're looking at pre-post data. You would need to keep some kind of identifier code sheet. If you say that you're going to assign codes to people on the pre-test, you would need to keep that code list so that you can match them up on the post-test in order to do the study. Okay, and so sometimes we have to point these things out and just ask for clarification. And I think that researchers quite often know what they're going to do, they just don't understand exactly what we're asking sometimes. So most of the applications we deal with may answer 1 and 2. The rest of these 3 not so much, but 3 is asking, will you provide a link or identifier to anyone outside of the research team? And if yes, explain why. And again, depends on what they're doing with the data. Maybe they need somebody to coordinate and match the data up with something that students are doing in a school. In that case, they would need to provide somebody outside the research team with those code links, okay? So it's not that it's bad, it's just that if this is happening, we want to understand why. Question 4, will audio, video, film, or digitally captured data be recorded? An example, this would be a survey. If you're going to, obviously you're going to get results of the surveys, whether you're using Checkbox, SurveyMonkey, or even Google Forms. That's digitally captured data. And so we want to know specifically, are you going to keep this? But if you look further on, please explain how the disposition of the recorded data will be handled. Indicate if it will be erased or destroyed at the conclusion of the study. If you wish to retain the recorded data beyond the conclusion of the study, you must provide justification. Subjects must be informed of the disposition of any recorded data via the informed consent process. And then please clarify how subjects will be identified in these responses. So for example, when I did my dissertation, mine was qualitative in nature, and I told them up front that the data were, the interviews, unless they objected, would be sent as part of an oral history project, and they would be identified. And so telling them up front, there was no problem with the IRB, and to be honest, there was no problem with the participants. All the people I interviewed agreed that they could have their interviews submitted to an oral history project. So again, this is just asking how they're going to get rid of this digitally recorded data, and to be sure that the participants know how this will happen. And they do that through the consent form. Question 5, where, how long, and in what format will these data be kept? Describe what security provisions will be taken to protect the data. Finally, specify when and how the data will be destroyed. So here, number 4 says, yes, we're going to capture this data. Number 5 says, how long are you going to keep it, and how are you going to get rid of it? And so we want to see things like it will be saved on a laptop computer that is password protected, or stored, if it's printed copies of surveys, that it's stored in a locked file cabinet, that kind of stuff. And then specify when and how the data are going to be destroyed. Typically this is deleted or shredded, quote unquote, in your drive, or the hard copies will be shredded at the conclusion of the study, or we've seen after a national presentation within a year of the end of the study, that kind of stuff. We just want to see some hardline notes of what is going to happen with the data. Question 6, will you place a copy of the consent form or other research study information in the participant's medical, personal, or educational record? To be quite frank with you, I've never seen this answered yes yet. None of the studies we've done require that. Will you require a federal certificate of confidentiality? Again, I've not come across this yet. This may come up in federal grants, though, so don't be surprised. And number 8, will any record of the subject's participation in the study be made available to his or her supervisor? If yes, explain. So again, these things are not bad. We just want to know if it's going to happen, why is it important that it happens? And the whole purpose of this is that, again, as the board, we're protecting the participants' rights. So that's part 5. It all deals with privacy procedures. Part 6 is one thing. It's the informed consent document. And the vast majority of our studies have a conformed consent document. We provide a model in adult informed consent. If a child, somebody under 18 years of old, usually 6 to 18, or maybe even 6 to 15, depending on the study, we would ask a parent to give consent that their child participate, and if the child is able to understand what they're doing, then we would ask for a minor assent form, A-S-S-E-N-T, an assent form. And we will come across a few of those each year where people working on master's degrees are wanting to study their students, and so they'll need an assent form. But this is where a lot of our concerns come from within the consent form. And so we will spend some time in another module talking about the consent form just by itself, and I'll show you that model consent form and the expectations for the NSU IRB. Part 7, risk and benefits. Here we're asking them, earlier we asked about a protected population, and they may have checked no, this is not involving a protected population. But here what we're doing is we're asking them, are there things involved in the research that may be possible risk or harm? And then we list them. Use of deception. Are you tricking your participants during the study? And we've had a few of those. Confidential records, manipulation of psychological or social variables. The next one there is a common one that we see in this section, any probing or personal or sensitive information. Presentation of materials which subjects might consider sensitive, offensive, threatening, or degrading. Possible invasion of privacy. The risk of physical injury or harm. You might see some of these come out of the health and kinesiology department. And it's not that they're putting people at risk, but if they're putting them on a treadmill, then we want to see those kinds of things. And what we do here as a board, if there's nothing checked here, and you get in as a reviewer and realize that, hey, this is asking some really personal questions, at least you as the reviewer feel these are personal questions, at that point you need to contact the chair of the board and recommend that, because you feel these are personal questions, that it be promoted up to a full board review. And we will then look at it as a full board. Okay, so there are two ways then you can see that we do full board reviews. If they are concentrating on a protected population, or if it's one of these risks and benefits. And then we look at those. The rest of the questions in Part 7, 2 through 5, deal with how they're going to address these. Question 2, describe the nature and degree of the risk. If there's nothing checked up there, then they're going to leave this blank or hopefully put NA. Question 3, explain what steps will be taken to minimize the risks or harms. Again, if nothing is checked, they're probably going to put NA. Questions 4 and 5, we want to see information presented here, and that's just the nature of the board at NSU, that we want to see some benefits to the participants and benefits to the researchers. And there is going to be a specific benefits section within the IRB application that you will see, and we want the things listed in 4 and 5 to also appear in the consent form. That's what I meant to say. Of the application. And again, it's not uncommon for me to ask researchers that they need to include some benefit to the participants. Otherwise, why would we want somebody to participate in the research? And when we review the consent form later on, you'll see some ideas. So number 4, describe the benefits of this research to the participant. Number 5, describe the benefits of this research to society or to research in general. Okay. And finally, number 7, the last piece here is compensation information. Will any compensation or inducements, course credits, be offered to the subjects for their participation? Most of the time, no. Sometimes, yes. We do have some that award a gift certificate or something. If yes, describe those inducements and include a statement in the informed consent document explaining how compensation will be handled in the event the participant withdraws from the study. And it's not uncommon. Back up in the early part of the section, we asked for funding. We just want to see where the money is coming from to make sure there's no conflict of interest. And it's usually from a grant or something, but here we see that the money is going to be offered. And the big thing here is that we want to see that money in the consent form, and we want the researchers to explain what will happen if the participant withdraws before the end of the study. Are they going to lose the chance at the inducement or not? Okay, and so that's a clarification question that's rather common that we ask researchers when they use some kind of inducements. So the rest of this is just talking about policy at NSU, and it's explaining that only one document will be submitted. It's not uncommon for, such as in Part 6, where the informed consent is here. This will sometimes format weirdly, and so they'll just attach it as an attachment at the end. Also, question Part 3, question 3, Part 4, question 3. Sometimes the questions, the formatting will be bad, and they'll just say attached at the end of this document, okay? So, while typically these are the last pages of the document, they're not always the last pages. If you don't see a consent form, then scroll down to the bottom, or the same with surveys or questionnaires. That explains to you the application to have a research project done. The next video will discuss the consent form specifically, and we'll take some time and look through that because that is one of the biggest areas where we ask for clarification.